I'm sure these measures will directly affect you. You have said that these measures are necessary. What is Lan Kwai Fong going to look like now, and do you think these measures are going to work in containing this virus?
Well, I think, I can understand Carrie Lam, the chief executive, because the big problem, she was getting a lot of pressure from the legislators, both pro-Beijing and the anti-Beijing, the pan-Democrats, to pass something. And also her advisors, the medical advisors, were saying that people were actually gathering, instead of keeping a 1.5 meter distance from one another. When people drink, they're gathering in the streets, getting together, and it was causing the spike in numbers. January, February, we were able to combat the numbers, and the numbers had really come down. And in March, business was starting to get better again for most of the tenants, and it was almost back to normal. And then mid-March came, when many of the returnees from overseas started to come back to Hong Kong for Easter, and many students. And so they all brought these, many came from the U.S., many came from Europe, and so they brought the virus back to Hong Kong, and they went out, and we didn't have a quarantine at that time. The 14-day quarantine only started last Thursday, and so you probably have 2 weeks of people who came in without a quarantine who really were congregating in areas like the Lan Kwai Fong area, which is one of the popular night spots in Hong Kong, and other areas. And so the number started spiking. As Steve said, yesterday was 39 cases. Most of them were all overseas returnees. The day before was 44 cases. And so I guess she had no choice. The problem that my tenants have, and many of the operators have, is that if you can't serve alcohol, they will go out of business because they're bars or clubs. That's the only thing they sell, basically. They're not restaurants. Restaurants can do home delivery. Not that that will sustain them, but the big problem they have is that we now have to go forward with finding a way. It's kind of like the UK did. UK closed for 3 months, but the government is picking up 80% of the salaries and 80% of the rent, and that will help. That's what we're appealing to the chief executive to really help these operators, because most are on life support at the moment. And if not, they will die, and you'll have a lot more unemployment, and because they're all SMEs. And so this is something, as a landlord, given a lot of concessions to help them, but you can only do so much.
Alan, there's an interpretation out there that by allowing restaurants to still operate and stay open, but just restricting alcohol sales, that the government perhaps can avoid giving out compensations to bars and restaurants. Is that how you see it?
No, because, people who are in the business know that in restaurant business, without alcohol, you basically just break even on your food, or even lose money on the food. The money comes from the alcohol. The profit comes from the selling alcohol, selling wine or beer or whatever it is. And that's the biggest problem that that the restaurants will have in general. Majority of the restaurants, there's 250,000 people that are employed in the industry, so it's not a small number. And as I say, they all work hand to mouth. You don't have a lot of chains, so they need to be looked after. It's really something, and I think seeing today, I've talked to Carrie Lam, and hopefully something will be worked out. She understands the problems, and she's getting a lot of feedback from other legislators who represent the restaurant industry, and so hopefully she will start to come around. I understand all the reasons that she's doing it. The last thing we need is the numbers spiking like they have been. I think possibly it's another 2 weeks that will happen, that the numbers will go up, and because of you didn't have the quarantine from 1st of March till about the the last Thursday. And so I think that you'll have 2 weeks of people coming in without quarantine, and that's probably what's happening at the moment. And so I think it'll spike for 2 weeks, and then as we did in January and February, it will come down.
Alan, it's Haslinda in Singapore. You talked about how some of the businesses are basically operating hand to mouth. There are about 100 restaurants and bars on Lan Kwai Fong, some of them at risk of going bankrupt. Would you consider perhaps deferring rent for some of your tenants?
Well, Haslinda, I have from the days of last year with the protests, it was affecting many of the operators. And so as a landlord, I went forward and did give concessions to many of the operators and was publicized around Hong Kong. And so I'll continue to do that, but you can only do that up to a certain point. You still have payments to banks and repayments and other things. And so the operators themselves also need to be able to help themselves. But we'll do whatever we can to tide us through this difficult period.
You also continue to talk to Carrie Lam, the chief executive. What are you seeking?
Well, we're seeking something that similar to the UK, whereby 80% of the wages and the rents are being looked after by the government. I think it's for 3 months. So depending on how long this lasts, I think that basically we now, I believe it shouldn't last longer than a month. I think the numbers can come down again, and after 2 weeks. So I'm hoping that this will, that she'll be able to come around, and I think she understands the problems of the moment. This was done in haste yesterday after a lot of pressure from legislators, and everyone in Hong Kong just wants the numbers to go back down and we can get back down to business. Retail has really been affected because before the close down of the borders, we had about approximately 300,000 people a day coming from China into Hong Kong between tourists and locals going back and forth. At the moment, after the lockdown of the borders with China, you have about 3,000 people a day, and it's certainly now it's come down to almost 300. So the retail, the economy here was built around the Chinese tourists coming to Hong Kong, shopping at all the big brand retail shops, and everything was built around the rents, the high rents that landlords were able to get was really based around the economy, the retail economy. But now it's a huge change, it's a big change, and I think what Hong Kong will be going through will be the same as the rest of the world, kind of a meltdown if this doesn't stop pretty soon.